Welcome to another episode of Angling Wisdom. I'm so glad that you've joined us today. And today's topic is going to be one that you're either going to love or you're going to hate. But hopefully you'll listen to it because it's going to be interesting. I guarantee it. We're going to talk about carp today. A little bit of the history, some of the loves and hates that people have, kind of explaining why people have a love-hate relationship with carp. And we're going to talk about what they do to the ecosystems, how they got here, all those types of things. And we're even going to talk a little bit about if you can eat them or not. So we're going to talk about carp today, but first I want to talk about our sponsor, which is PK Lures. Again, thank you to PK for sponsoring this podcast. If you haven't been to pklure.com, go check it out. You can get 20% off of your order by using the code WISDOM at checkout. They have a lot of great lure options. If you're out there going for trout, walleye, bass, crappie, you can find something at pklure.com that'll help you out. Recently, we went to Keyhole. You can see that in the previous episode. We caught them on cranks trolling, and I actually took my family again, and we did that a few weeks later, and it worked again. So the PK Ridgeline Gen 2 is killer. So go to pklure.com, use the code WISDOM at checkout, get 20% off. All right, let's talk about carp. So carp, for me, have always been a species that I absolutely hated. The reason for that is my whole life, everybody says they're an invasive species. They're horrible. We don't want them here. They shouldn't have been here in the first place. And they're hard on the ecosystem. And that is true in a lot of places. They've messed up some bodies of water, but they're everywhere. And so the reality is that carp are all over the place. Just about anywhere in North America, you can find a carp population someplace. Now, what I appreciate about carp is they are really fun to catch. They fight really hard. They tend to be pretty good sized. And I found out a couple of years ago, they actually can be prepared for eating. So we'll talk about that too. But first, let's talk about the history of carp, because I've heard over the years lots of different things about how they got here, why they're here. So I did the research, and you can check out the show notes to see where I got my information. But carp have been here since about the 1870s. And the reason that carp were brought over here were kind of twofold. So the first reason being is that carp are super popular. I don't know if you know this, but super popular in Europe and in Asia. Carp originally originated, it's kind of redundant. Carp originated in Asia, and people love them for their fight. They love them for their qualities as a fish. They have they're very strong. They migrate through really tough conditions. That's why the Asians regarded them so high. And then, of course, they like to eat them as well. And then Europeans also fell in love with the fish. They brought them to monasteries. They brought them to castles, put them in private ponds. The aristocracy tended to have carp. And so they were held in high regard in Europe as well. Well, a whole bunch of Europeans settled in the United States. And after the Civil War, under the Grant administration, people were begging for carp to be stocked across the United States. So you have to ask yourself, why were people begging for carp to be stocked? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Western expansion was really hard on a lot of the natural ecosystems. All right. So there were a lot of swamps, a lot of areas that they drained that had native fish species like pike, sauger, walleye, those kind of things. And Western expansion was tough on those native fish species. Plus, a lot of them were subsistence. So they would catch fish until they couldn't catch fish anymore because they were feeding their families. They were eating them. And they were also polluting. So during that time, people were going after gold. They were going after all kinds of different things. And it was really hard on the environment. It was hard on native fish who, most of our native fish can't handle turbidity in the water. They can't handle a lot of the things that happened as a result of westward expansion. But people knew that carp were tough. And anybody that's ever caught a carp knows carp are about the toughest fish on the planet. I say carp and catfish are probably two of the toughest fish out there. And I mean, you can have them in hot water, or, warmer water, turbid water, cold water. They tend to survive no matter what. Whereas a trout, you look at it wrong and it dies. So carp are the antithesis of that. They are really tough. And so there was this huge push for it. And there was a guy named Dr. Spencer Baird. He was appointed by President Grant to have a commission on fisheries and look at what they could do to have sustainable food stock and sustainable fishing for the westward expansion for all the different people that were settling across the United States as well as in the eastern part of the United States. So the very first big batch that was brought in by the government was brought into Baltimore and Maryland area, and they only stocked a few. But those few, as we all know with carp, didn't take them long to spawn and have more and more and more carp. And so it was very successful. People really enjoyed eating carp, so it was very popular. And then what happened is there was also a guy who stocked them in California. His name was Julius Pope, and he wanted to have like a fish farm with carp. And so he stocked a few, and then before too long, he had a whole bunch. He had an abundance of carp, and they were selling that carp meat back then. This is in the late 1800s. Keep in mind, people didn't make a lot of money. But they were selling it for $1 a pound. So a lot of you are probably thinking, man, people actually ate carp. Well, the fact is, people eat carp all over the place. In most places of the world, the United States is just not as popular. And here's why. At least this is the theory. Obviously, I wasn't alive back then, so I can't tell you the full story because I wasn't there. But from what it sounds like is that because carp do really well, as they started to stock them all over the country, they went from being the food of the aristocracy, which at the time in New York restaurants, you could buy carp and it cost more than halibut. So it was very much something that the rich people ate. But as soon as all the ponds, lakes, streams started to fill up with carp, the poor people started eating carp too. And so the rich people thought, well, we can't be associated with that. So we got to switch to something else. So then they preferred other foods. And the other thing about carp is people started seeing carp survive in environments where fish, like native species, maybe like a largemouth bass or rainbow trout, could not survive because of the pollution, because of those other factors. And because of that, they got a bad reputation and they were called a trash fish. Almost everyone who's heard of carp or has talked about carp has heard the term trash fish. And I think that's where a lot of that comes from, is that people have a misunderstanding about carp and they don't understand that they're just a tough fish. I mean, they call them rough fish because they are. But the fact of it is they can survive just about anything. There's jokes out there that they're going to survive like a nuclear war, and they probably will. That's just carp. They survive just about everything. But that's how they got here, and it didn't take long for the United States to go, this probably isn't a good thing for the species that have already been here, and because they weren't rebounding, right? Because the pollution, because all the things that had happened, the carp were doing fine, but the rest of the fish were not. And so then they started doing focused efforts on the other fish, the actual fish that belong here. And so carp got a bad reputation. And so my whole life I've been told carp are horrible, carp are trash fish. And, it really started to question that. My friend Seth, he actually brought me some smoked carp a couple of years ago. I tried it. It was excellent. And I realized there's a reason that the Europeans wanted to have them over here. They do taste good. They have a ton of bones in them, but they are absolutely delicious to eat if done properly. And of course, where you catch them probably matters quite a bit. I'm lucky. I have places where I can catch them that the water is in good condition. That's not the case everywhere in the United States. And some of you have probably tried carp and went, that was one of the most disgusting things I've ever had. Or those things are so bony, I don't want to eat them. But that's how carp got here. So now you have a little bit of the history of how they ended up in the United States and kind of why they ended up in the US. At the time when Dr. Baird was looking on the commission at bringing carp here, he was getting about 2,000 letters a year for people requesting carp to be stocked across the area in their areas, in private ponds and lakes, streams, all those things. And they did kind of take over. So some of the common problems with carp that a lot of you probably have already seen is that they're really tough, they're resilient, and they spawn, and they can spawn up to 4 times per year, which I read that in this article and I was like, that's crazy. That's a lot. Cause you think about most fish species, they're spawning once a year. They're spawning in the springtime and they're done. And that's not the case with carp. They can continue to spawn. They typically spawn in water that's 64 to 70 degrees in temperature. And so if the water stays like that, they can continue to make eggs and they can continue to spawn. And that can be a problem because they can overwhelm a body of water. In fact, I live close to a body of water named Ocean Lake. And the Game and Fish has tried for years to get rid of the carp that are in there. It used to be a crystal clear body of water, and it had great largemouth and crappie and perch fishing. And now, not so much. There's a ton of carp in there. They tried using rotenone, which is basically a fish killing substance. I'll just say it that way. But it's a poison to get rid of the fish. And they've tried that. That didn't work. They tried a commercial fishery for carp there. That didn't work. And so carp are pretty tough to get rid of. Once you have them, you have them. Unless you have a really small body of water that you can use rotenone and wipe out the whole thing and start over, you're probably going to be stuck with them. So some of the other things that they do is they actually secrete phosphorus because they eat a lot of plant life. And so when they secrete that phosphorus into the water, it can help encourage algae blooms, which none of us like. And that is a pretty common thing around farm country anyway. But algae blooms can be pretty hard on bodies of water. So they also increase the turbidity of the water. So basically, what I mean by that is water that's clear is not turbid, but if it looks really muddy and kind of mucky, that's turbidity. So carp actually contribute to that. Another thing that they do is, they outcompete other species. So they get bigger and they school up and they just kind of crowd everything else out unless there's a major predator that can keep them under control, which is pretty tough to do. Muskies will eat them, tiger muskies eat them, pike eat them. But they do provide a fairly decent food stock for other fish that eat other fish, but carp grow so fast that pretty soon they get big enough that they don't have to worry about a whole lot other than eagles and anglers. So carp are tough, and once you have them, it's really tough to get rid of them. But there are some benefits to carp. The reason that the Europeans liked them so much is that they do taste good. I mean, if you catch them out of good water, and I know some of you are shaking your heads saying, no, Patrick, there's no way. I just got done with a batch of smoked carp. It actually does taste really good. It can be done. They are a good food stock. There's a reason Europeans, Asians love to eat them, especially. So they're good for that. They also, they create a lot of young, so, obviously spawning so much. So if you have like a walleye reservoir, walleyes eat lots of little carp, so it is a food stock for some of the other species. As long as things don't get out of balance, they start to outcompete those. Some of the other things too that I like about carp is that they fight like crazy. You'd be hard pressed to find another fish for its size that fights as hard as they do. I mean, some fight a little bit faster. You have fish that are a little bit faster. But as far as endurance goes and just overall power, carp are tough. If you've ever caught a 20+ pound carp, it's a fight. And so they are fun to catch. And they're abundant. I mean, they can live just about anywhere. We have them all over the US. They can be used for fertilizer. They have tons of different uses. So there are some benefits to having carp, but some of the drawbacks outweigh the benefits for sure, especially when you have fisheries where you have species that can't compete with them. They can be a real issue. So the question then becomes, what do we do about carp? And why do I even care about carp at all? Most bodies of water, they've kind of come into equilibrium to where they can. But one of the things that you can do is you can actually fish for them. And a lot of people don't realize this, but carp are really fun to catch. They're easy to catch depending on the method that you use. If you want to challenge yourself, you can go after them with a fly rod. I know a lot of people that have done that. They like woolly boogers. They like things that imitate little crawfish because they are omnivores. They eat just about anything. They don't just eat on the bottom. A lot of people think that carp exclusively eat on the bottom. Now, they do eat a lot on the bottom. They like to eat, the bugs that are coming up, the worms that are coming up out of the bottom, but they also eat the plant life down there. But as, hatches happen, you'll see that they start feeding on the surface and they feed in the middle of the water column. I've caught them on crankbaits. I've caught them on jigs. I've caught them on just about everything. So carp are really easy to pursue because they're plentiful. They're everywhere. There's lots of different methods, but I learned about a method that I'm going to tell you about. And that's kind of the focus of this is if you actually want to go out and target them. I found a method on YouTube from the Catfish and Carp channel. So I'll give them a shout out. It works amazing. And it's called using a pack bait. And so this winter, it was cold and nasty and I had a shoulder surgery. So I was sitting around watching some YouTube on the weekends because I couldn't fish. And I wanted to learn about carp fishing. And so I learned about pack baits. And so what pack baits are, it's basically a mixture. And the one that I used here recently, I'll talk about it here in a little bit, was oats, sweet corn, and Jello mix. So like strawberry Jello. You basically you pour the whole can of sweet corn, a little bit of oats and some of this Jello together, and you mix it up with your hand in a bucket or in a bag, and you make a bait. And you would think, how in the heck are you going to put that on a hook? How do you do this? Well, luckily, this catfish and carp guy shows you how to use a hair rig, which is like a European style rig. It's basically a hook with a piece of monofilament coming off the back. And I'll try to show a video for the YouTube people so that they can see what I'm talking about. But there's like a piece of monofilament that is tied onto a snell, onto a hook, but it sticks off out the back of the hook and it has a little loop on it. And you use this baiting needle, which you can buy on Amazon, which is what I did. And you thread on the corn, then you hook this little loop and you slide that bait on. And then as part of these kits, they have like bait stoppers that go onto your loop to help keep the corn from coming off. But you don't actually put the corn on the hook at all, which was shocking to me. Like you can do it that way, but you don't have to do it that way. The other thing that I got as part of this pack bait system is there's these things that you can buy called method leads. And what it is, it's basically a plastic cage with a piece of lead poured into it. And what that does is it allows you to pack that mixture onto there. And then you can put your hook into that mixture to cast it out. And what happens is when that mixture and that method lead goes down to the bottom, it sits flat on the bottom and the carp can smell and taste that Jello mix and the sweet corn and the oats in the water, and they come over to eat it because they really like that for whatever reason. And they'll start nibbling around, and that pack bait slowly starts to dissolve in the water. What happens is they'll find that string of corn that you put on that hair rig, they'll suck that up. And as they turn to swim away, that hook gets them right in the corner of the mouth. It's really sweet. I didn't believe that it would work until I actually went out and did it, and it was amazing. It worked really, really well. So we fished a pack bait. All you really need for that, you need a swivel, you need a hair rig, a method letter, some kind of a weight, a bait threading needle, and you can do it. I mean, it's super simple to do. Go check out that guy's channel. He's got 1 million plus followers, so you can see what all he's been doing. But it's really quite cool, and it's really fun, and it's super, super easy to do. I mean, anybody can do it. But the reason that pack bait works so well is, again, it gives off the scent, which carp have amazing olfactory. They can smell really, really well in the water, so they can taste as well because they have those barbels, so they can figure out where your bait's at pretty quickly. And we actually did this at Keyhole. It was really, really windy. We had been catching walleye and crappie, and it was just super windy out. And so we went and parked the boat, went down to the shore, and I saw that there were carp down there. And so we threw out some pack baits on the bottom, and it wasn't long. And the carp started coming in, and it was super exciting because we were fishing in maybe a foot and a half of water, but you could watch the carp come up and hit the bait. That is super fun and exciting to watch them come up and forage around and grab that corn and then take off and then hook themselves. So that was really, really cool. But we also had a goal this year. And so I want to talk about kind of the impetus of why we were trying to fish for carp. Every year, the Kiwanis Club here in Riverton, where I live, has a fishing derby for kids. And the fishing derby are scored by length of fish. And so we wanted to find the longest fish possible that we could catch. In this body of water, there's largemouth bass, there's stocker rainbow trout, there's a handful of channel catfish, there's green sunfish, there's yellow perch, and there's carp. So if you want to win, you can kind of see where I'm going with this. If you want to win and you want your kids to win, you got to kind of figure out how to fish for carp. So I was looking at how do I do this to give my kids the best opportunity to win it. And my oldest daughter, this was going to be her last hurrah. This was her last fishing tournament. So she wanted to go out on top. We schemed how to put all this together. We did the research, we looked at it, figured it out, and we went and deployed that system. That was the first time I had fished this system. I hadn't fished it before. And we came to a spot where I could see there were some carp kind of sucking on the surface. So I was like, well, that's where we're going to go. And so we started fishing right there. And when we did, it didn't take very long. We caught a small one and then we caught some nicer ones. And so she ended up winning her age group and winning the whole thing with a 24.5-inch carp. And she caught 3 about that size, which was really cool. She had a blast reeling them in. And, you know, if you have any of those kind of things in your area and you got kids and the fishing derby is by length, fish for the carp. Learn how to do this system. It's super fun. And the kids just love the fight. I mean, the fight is amazing. In fact, I didn't have quite the proper setup. I didn't have the rod holders with the bite alarms. I didn't have all that fancy gear. We were just basically throwing it out there, setting the rod down and watching the rod because the water is fairly turbid in the particular pond that we were fishing. And there were a couple of times we almost lost my rod. In fact, one of them where my daughter had to jump in and get it, which was pretty funny. But if you don't pay attention to your rod, or if you don't have the fancy rod, you know, setups that some of these carp guys have, you got to really pay attention because you can lose a rod in a hurry. But it makes it way exciting too to see your rod just about fly off into the reservoir or into the pond. So I would encourage you to try it out. It was a lot of fun. You know, pack baits are definitely more effective than fishing just a worm on the bottom. That's what some of these people were doing, and we had people right next to us fishing a worm on the bottom. They weren't catching anything, and we were catching fish after fish after fish on this method led using this pack bait. So try a pack bait out. It's kind of fun. And like I said, I've tried smoked carp. I will warn you, bony, super bony. There's tons of bones in carp, just like in suckers. But I'll tell you what, man, it's the smoked ham of smoked fish. I mean, it tastes very similar to smoked ham. It's very good. Give it a try. We'll do a video on that, show you how I do the smoked carp. But yeah, get out there and fish, try something different. The other thing too, if you want to help, you know, rid your bodies of water of carp, there's a couple of ways that I know of people doing it. A lot of people do carp shoots, or you can go out there, you can catch them on a rod and reel, which is way more fun, I think. But I'm biased, but catching them on rod and reel is really fun, especially when you can watch them come up and hit the bait. It's super, super fun. So I'll put some stuff out there in the future of how to process them because it is a bit of a chore, but go out there and do some carp fishing. It's a lot of fun. You can get your kids on it. It's not difficult to do at all. And so I hope this has been helpful. Hopefully you learned a little bit of something about carp and maybe understand a little bit better of how they got here and kind of why they're here. But I want to thank you again for listening. I really appreciate you. And we'll look forward to seeing you on the next episode of Angling Wisdom.